Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride and I'm joined this evening by two excellent guests. Firstly, by former SNP MP and Director of Momentous Change, Roger Mullen. Roger, how are you this evening?
Good evening, I'm fine, Kenny. I hope you are too.
Excellent. And on the other side of me, a guest I've not met before is Dr. Alan Flowers, an academic at Kingston University London, with expertise in Belarus, Ukraine and Georgia. Dr. Alan, how are you this evening?
Fine, good evening and greetings from London.
Well, thank you both very much for joining us. And the reason we've got you two to join us this evening is because we are going to be discussing Russia and in the wake of the ISC report into Russia that was released earlier this week. But before we get into all of that, we are going to hit the news headlines first of all. So we start, as we always do, with our coronavirus update. And as of 2 p.m. today, a total of 337,519 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK government regional testing centres. Of these, 318,999 were confirmed negative, 18,520 were positive. There are 20 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Scotland today. But again, there have been no new reported deaths of people who have tested positive today. This, of course, will be an underestimate of the total number of cases, as not everyone with the virus will display symptoms, and not all those with symptoms will necessarily be tested. Although, as always, we do urge you, if you are showing any symptoms, please do get yourself tested as soon as possible. Of the people who have tested positive, there were 278 people in hospital last night, 2 of whom were in intensive care. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection remains at 2,491. This number only includes those who have died in hospital having received a positive test for the virus. The latest UK daily figures available show 45,677 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 123. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just those in hospitals. Travellers from an additional 5 countries will no longer need to quarantine for 14 days on arrival in Scotland. From Tuesday the 28th of July, passengers from Estonia, Latvia, Slovenia, Slovakia and St Vincent and the Grenadines will be exempt from quarantine rules. The decision follows a review of infection prevalence rates of coronavirus. Exemptions are kept under regular review and could be reinstated if prevalence rates increase. The UK government must abandon its plans to introduce an effective veto on Scottish democracy through its new internal market rules, the Scottish Greens have said today. The party has warned that Tory plans to ensure a uniform approach across the 4 nations of the UK presents a serious threat to devolved commitments on the environment, food standards, public health and public ownership. Green co-leader Patrick Harvie has written to Business Secretary Alok Sharma demanding that the UK government rewrites its plans with a clear commitment to protect the democratic authority of the Scottish Parliament. Finance Secretary Kate Forbes has again highlighted the restrictions of the UK's fiscal frameworks following a virtual meeting today with Stephen Barclay, the UK's Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and the Finance Ministers of Wales and Northern Ireland. The powers we seek are reasonable, straightforward and would not cost the UK government a penny, she said. Unlike other countries across the world, we cannot respond quickly to emerging needs by borrowing, leaving us overly dependent on policy decisions made by the UK government, she continued. All 3 devolved governments have expressed similar concerns throughout the coronavirus pandemic. The number of people in the UK infected with COVID-19 has stopped falling and now stands at around 1 in 2,000 people who are not in hospitals or care homes, the Office for National Statistics said today. Across the UK, the R rate now stands between 0.7 and 0.9, meaning new cases are falling by roughly 1 to 4% each day, although the rate in England is said to be higher at between 0.8 and 1, and 63 local authorities in England have seen a rise in new cases this week. Any R number above 1 means exponential growth in new cases, potentially leading to another significant wave of infections. The R number in all 3 devolved nations appears to be at a safer level. The Archdiocese of Glasgow has today concluded the transfer of ownership of the former St Peter's Cemetery in Cardross to new owners. The Kilmahue Education Trust, the new owners of the site, plan to develop it as an asset for the local community while respecting the unique archaeological status of the building. The A-listed building was opened to great acclaim in 1966, but closed in 1980 due to a decline in the number of seminarians, problems maintaining the structure, and complaints that it was never truly fit for purpose. It briefly became a drug rehab centre in the early 80s, but has been mostly abandoned since 1984. And that is all the headlines for today. And so we do come to the Russia Report. And where I'd like to start, if I could, and I'll turn, I think, to you first on this, Alan. A lot of people particularly people on the left, and a number of people in the independence movement have this instinctive reaction that anything that the British security services are concerned about is something that they shouldn't be concerned about. So tell us, from your perspective, with your experience in the Eastern European regions, why should we think of Russia as a threat to global security?
We should think of Russia as a threat to global security because it's been a proven threat to its neighbours and also the international order. Now, as we just briefly discuss some examples of this threat, let us clearly separate the Russian government, the leadership, and the authorities there from the Russian people, many of whom are extremely unhappy about the abuses that are exercised, particularly by their government, on neighbouring countries. The Soviet system created a network of peoples and families who know each other and are interrelated. So it is no joy to many of the Russian people that their government is exercising abuses in a war at this present moment in Ukraine, with losses of life daily on the Ukrainian people, many of whom are actually related to people living in Russia. But think back to the Georgian issue, an invasion in 2008, the perpetual war in Abkhazia that has gone on now for nearly 30 years. Russia has exercised, well, not just in recent decades, but actually since the time of Stalin, a policy of destabilization on the borders. The problem is you have a head of state whose life objective is to be the new Tsar, to reunite a former Soviet Union. And therefore actions that would attempt to return the neighboring countries of Russia, like Ukraine, Georgia, and Belarus, into a new Russian Union are very much a threat in the neighborhood, not to mention the destabilization attempts, the like of which we've now seen more evidence of in the context of United Kingdom and also in America. And anything that will destabilize or distract the West is now an action, an open season for the current Russian government directed by Vladimir Putin.
And Roger, turning to you, the US and the UK have propped up dictators around the world, even installed people like Pinochet in Chile. So where does our kind of moral high ground on this issue come from, do you think?
Well, I don't think this is being looked at from the point of view of where the moral high ground. I think it's being looked at in terms of what the interests are of the state that we currently live in, the United Kingdom. And we do have an interest in this. I've got an interest, as I'm sure all your viewers have, in maintaining as much democratic culture as possible in our country. When we have ambitions, for example, to move towards independence, we want to be able to do that through democratic means and not have to resort to fighting or any other form of subterfuge. And therefore, we've got an interest in preserving as much as an effective democratic institutions here as possible. And the thing to remember is, although you've raised the issue of the USA and the UK. As I'm sure Alan will know even better than myself, they have been involved in trying to destabilise aspects of democratic institutions in many countries in the world, not least, for example, France at one stage. And therefore, this is a state that we need to be very careful about and very careful about their motives. I would also say, I think very much I would agree with everything Alan has said in his opening remarks, which I think were particularly important for us to remember, that I want to see other countries in the world to be able to realise and attain their independence. And I think the threat that Russia poses to many of its neighbours runs against what we would see as part of our moral view of the world.
And Roger, again, many people will say that we just have to kind of accept the fact that countries like, as you say, every country has its own objectives and will try to move the pieces on the global chessboard to suit itself. Is there a sense in which we just have to accept that Russia is going to try and interfere just the way that we are going to try and interfere in some countries, and this is just the new normal of the way the global order works?
I'm not sure I would wholly agree with the way in which you put that. I certainly think all countries have got an interest in protecting themselves and maintaining the effective functioning on behalf of their own people. So I think showing an interest in the way in which Russia have been acting towards us is a perfectly legitimate concern of us, just as it's a concern of other countries of how we and others might operate internationally. I've got deep concerns about the United Kingdom. I've got deep concerns about the way in which some of our foreign adventures have been acting against what I would see as our correct moral outlook in the world. But that does not give a free pass to Russia to behave however it wishes in relationship to us or to its neighbours.
And Alan, this concern that has emerged recently, particularly since 2016, where there were serious allegations about Russian interference in the American election, as well as then in the Brexit referendum. How big a problem is that for Britain and the US, for the West generally? And is it the same problem that the countries like Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia are facing, or is it a different kind of problem, do you think?
Very similar problem. Really no surprise. I have academic links with an institution in Ukraine. It's called a University of Life Safety, and they have a contract from the Ukraine government to deal with cybersecurity training and research. And we've known about these kinds of activities at least since around the period of 2014 and before. And of course, how big a problem is it? Well, I agree absolutely with Roger there. This is about a people's right of their own secure, fair and free self-determination. The philosophy of Soviet Union, and now inherited by Russia, has been to use resources or technology to control neighboring or international states. By the way, I'll give an older example. The energy policy of the Soviet Union was to make sure Moscow controlled the gas and controlled the heating for the peripheral states. They could turn Belarus on and off if they want. Now they're using a modern day version of that, the internet, cyber warfare issues, and that can reach out, the tentacles reach right across the world. So yes, this is yet another wake-up call. There have been numerous wake-up calls, and the security of our decision-making processes in the United Kingdom and America and all the Western countries clearly needs a massive overhaul. By the way, we might criticize our rather old-fashioned paper voting system, but there's nothing like an old-fashioned paper voting system to avoid any electronic interference whatsoever. So yes, a problem, and yes, let's be very wary of the potential of these electronic tentacles to stretch into every way of our life.
Our issues in the West for a moment. Could you tell us a little bit about what Russia is doing that's so dangerous in places like Ukraine, Belarus? What kind of activities are happening there that perhaps we
Well, of
don't
course,
hear every day on the news here?
yes, of course. Well, I mean, there's a whole spectrum. You have to look to what is the end objective. The end objective is to carry out any means at their disposal to destabilize the current government. And if in 2014 they'd had their way, the tanks would have been rolling across southern Ukraine, and there was at one point where physical force is one issue. The use of military force that actually was arrested. There is, of course, the use of finance and money. I mean, London is a huge, massive example of the way Russian money is buying its way into influence. It's the same situation in Ukraine, and there's grave concern about the relationship of the present president of Ukraine to Russian oligarchs and the extent to which there aren't controlling influences there. In the case of Belarus, things switch off and on. The present dictator, Alexander Lukashenko, in power for 26 years, has played a game of exploiting Russia's desires of controlling influence. We have to remember they've got the ability to put their forces into Belarus on an agreement there. And in a case similar, issues in Russia, and all of the Latvia is another problem. That's in the European Union. We really should watch and look to the situation in the Baltic states, particularly Latvia, because they have a very substantial Russian-speaking population in eastern Latvia, around Daugavpils, right on the border actually with Belarus. Now, Belarus, let's remember, is a country that Putin can have his forces in hours if he really wants to. So actions are a combination of the use of cyber warfare, the use of Russian money, and the use of force. It's a full spectrum attack on neighboring countries. And you see this from day to day, week to week in countries like Georgia, Ukraine, Belarus, and to some extent Baltic states as well.
A lot of people have warned that we shouldn't be kind of letting ourselves fall into another Cold War with Russia. Clearly, that's not going to benefit many people. How close is that to happening now, or is this something that the West, you think, is trying to avoid?
Well, the person who's turned the refrigerator on is no less than Vladimir Putin. I mean, we are in a new form of cold, somewhat chilly at least, relations. That's self-evident, and it's been self-evident for most of the last two decades. Very quickly after the ascendancy of Vladimir Putin, those around him started to work on their desire to strengthen Russia and reunite Russia as far as possible with their neighbors, and also exercise more wide international influence. So, it's a case of we are where we are. Always cooperation with the Russian people. I would never be against academic, cultural exchanges. And one of the best things we can do, actually, is through the process of opening up to the people themselves. Let's continue to extend that hand of friendship. Let's continue to ensure that as many of the Russian people really do realize, how what the values are of Europe and much of the Western world. And the only hope for the future change is that the people themselves exercise eventually, and it'll be difficult, that the people of Russia exercise their own powers of self-determination. Not going to be easy for them. Belarus is in the process of doing that at the moment, and it's not going to be easy for Belarus, although many Belarusian people want to remove a dictator that's been there for 26 years. The Ukrainians have exercised their right of self-determination. They had their democracy uprising in 2004, and again, they had to have a revolution of dignity against a corrupt government in 2014. So it's not pleasant. There is a fight back, but this is something the Russian people will have to deal with. It's not easy for the West to deal with it. We just have to defend ourselves. Defense is the answer, and we have to leave the Russian people to their self-determination.
Mm-hmm. Roger, if I could turn to you for a moment. There are obviously various international bodies that butt up against Russia. I mean, NATO was established as a barrier against Russia during the Cold War, and we also now have the EU, which includes, as Alan was saying, the Baltic states. What do you think the role is of international bodies like NATO and the EU and even the UN when it comes to kind of restraining Russia's more aggressive tendencies just now?
Well, there's a couple of things I would say. The first thing is, when you're talking about international organizations, many of these international organizations have been on the go for a very long period of time. And I do think a reasonable case can be made that they all need to be reformed in the light of the modern world. If I take the most obvious example, the permanent members of the UN Security Council are there because of the consequences of the Second World War. Many people would argue it's time to change that and to change it so that these organizations do become even more international in their outlook. I think in some ways too, I would like very much to reflect back on what Alan has said, because I think he's made a very profound and really important point. And that is, we have to distinguish between the peoples in troubled lands and their governments. I've spent a long part of my career, long before I became an MP, working in different parts of the world, in different countries, in Africa, in the Middle East, and the like. And some of these places were dangerous, and some of these places did not have a high regard for their own people. And I've always thought that in terms of international engagement, an important role that we could play, that Scotland could play, for example, as a small country, is to make sure we engage with the people so far as possible in cultural, in educational, and in other purposeful ways. I think that's very important. So we mustn't think of the world as only made up of governments. We have to think of the world as made up of peoples, and it is through engaging through the peoples of the world that I think we can make an important contribution. In terms of what the world is going to look like and how these institutions are going to react in the future, unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball to answer that at present. The world is in a state of considerable change, not least because at the moment we're going through this pandemic, we're going through a lot of social change, we're looking at the growth of populations in different parts of the world that are changing the nature of where the balance of power lies economically and the like. So the world is changing fast, and we need to be able to think creatively, and we need our institutions to be able to be more open and outward looking, in my view, than they have been in the past.
On the same note, in recent years, we've seen Donald Trump kind of not withdraw, but kind of pull back a bit on American commitments to NATO, to the UN. We've seen the UK withdraw from the EU. How big a difference does that make when it comes to how those organizations are able to confront what Russia's been doing?
Well, the important thing is that Britain has not withdrawn from NATO, and the aspect that is most important in respect to defence is that Russia, Vladimir Putin, will see that there are certain actions he would carry out would be a tripwire, which would be very seriously problematic for him. And to give an example, Britain was in there reinforcing Estonia, and we now have divisions of the British Army. Now, this is unfortunate that we have to talk about force, but you have a head of state whose popularity amongst a certain group, a very large group of the Russian population, is based on the fact that he is their new Stalin. He is the strong man of Russia. He is making Russia great again in terms of outstretch of power, and even to some extent in terms of conquest. That he is acting, particularly, and has been acting in Ukraine. And that's another example. Britain is proudly present in a training capacity, advisory capacity with an international force. So, okay, yes, we may have withdrawn from essentially an economic bloc. Let's remember the EU, yes, that's an economic aspect, and it is certainly in Russia's interest that we might do something that weakens the West economically. The economic issues is one pillar, but also defence, military, the application of force is another pillar. And what we certainly will find is that Britain has not withdrawn from those aspects, and has actually been very engaged in bolstering the West and laying down red lines as regards to future Russian aggression. And I would close by pointing out we're in a very dangerous period with Vladimir Putin coming up for an election, and he needs to do something popular. And unfortunately, some form of aggression or engagement in either neighboring states or something that will strengthen Russia's worldwide position is something he is looking for now, by the month. So watch this space, because the Belarusian piece of the jigsaw could be one of them. Is Belarus going to stay an independent state? And we already know that the threat of disturbances, particularly in the Baltics, Latvia with its Russian population there, and Estonia, which has a border with Russia, very dangerous times. And it's good to see that, at least on the military front, we're there, where clearly, and where the recent report points out, in terms of the economic financial front, we've been seen to be very weak and wanting, and there certainly still are dangers in the cyber front as well. Britain really needs to be working internationally in that. So yes, there is an aspect of the potential for Brexit to cause economic weakness and a bit of instability on the economic side, but the economic side is only one part of a very complex bastion of defences, varied defences, that we should be ensuring keep strong against Russian ambitions.
You've given me an excellent segue there, because I did want to come on to this question of money. This is something that was a major part of the Russia report, was this mention of Londongrad, this idea that there is enormous amounts of Russian money, often dirty money, flowing through London, which is, as we know, is one of the great money laundering centres of the world. Roger, if I could come to you, how big a problem is this money laundering centre that we see in London?
Well, in my view, it's huge. And in my view, in this regard, the Russia report is very weak. Let me give you some examples from my own time as when I was a member of Parliament. Some of your viewers may know I fought as hard as I could a campaign to try and tighten up the City of London and to try and tighten up the financial sector. For example, trying to get better regulation of things called Scottish limited partnerships. Now, Scottish Limited SLPs were involved in one of the great scandals that involved the City of London called the Russian laundromat. There were hundreds of SLPs used to channel more than £56 billion of money out of Russia between 2010 and 2014. And the UK government was turning a blind eye to this. Indeed, I remember having a meeting. I eventually got a meeting with the Financial Secretary to the Treasury at the time, Jane Ellison, and her civil servants. And I took her through the type of criminality that was going on through the use of limited partnerships and the involvement of Russia and other states. And basically, they weren't interested in acting. What they were interested in was simply in protecting, as they saw it, the interests of the City of London. They didn't want to do anything to disrupt those. So in this regard, I was hugely disappointed in looking at the Russian report to see that when they mentioned the Russia laundromat, it was like one sentence, and they never mentioned the role of the City of London effectively being complicit and effectively being allowed to be complicit by the UK government in this. So I think there are problems with financial institutions in the UK. I certainly think there's a lot more work that needs to be done to try and tighten up. And I think certainly for the future of Scotland, we want to have financial institutions that are able to act with greater transparency and with a greater sense of morality than is currently the situation in the UK government, which I think has been appalling in the way in which it has allowed knowingly criminality to emerge into the system.
This kind of turning a blind eye seems is a theme in the report, and this question of the amount of money that's flowing through London. We know it's not just Russian crime that's cleaning its money through there. We know that, for example, Mexican drug cartels are pumping lots of money through London as well. How has that come to be? Is that a conscious policy of the UK government to allow London to develop this money laundering facility, or is it something that's happened and now it's difficult to challenge because of the power of big money?
Well, certainly it's in the interest, or has been in the interest of many people operating in the financial markets in London to make as much money as possible and not to worry too much what the source of that money is. I mean, you rightly say, of course, it's not just about Russian oligarchs that are close to Putin, although they do deal and move billions through London. It involves other countries as well. It involves other types of criminality. The way in which I would put it is, why is London so attractive for many states to move ill-gotten gains, for criminals to use it as a base? And in my view, it's because many of our financial bodies lack the type of transparency that control. One thing that I exposed when I was an MP, not just limited partnerships, but if you take all types of company formations in the United Kingdom, they're supposed to register in particular ways, and they're supposed to act appropriately according to the law. There are more than 4 million such businesses in one form or another registered through Companies House. When I was a Member of Parliament, I asked questions to try and find out how many people were employed through Companies House throughout the UK in terms of enforcement to making sure they were living up to those standards, given there are 4 million registered businesses. The answer was 6 people. So what we've had is a government establishing a regime where there are many different types of formations of businesses. There are 4 million registrations, but they only have 6 people looking after to make sure that they're living up to the registered obligations in terms of transparency and other things. When you add to that, you have firms, the likes of Scottish Limited Partnerships, which are not really Scottish. in any really meaningful sense nowadays. They were created in 1907 by Herbert Asquith and remained in relatively unaltered form right through up until the present time. They were hardly used until 2008, until the financial crisis came along. And then within a few years, thousands upon thousands were registered by foreign individuals and companies, foreign businesses, including from the East. And they were being used then, because of their lack of transparency, as an easy vehicle to move funds. Now we still need to tighten up on this. I mean, I wish I had been wholly successful in my campaign. We managed to get little bits of improvement, but there's a long way to go. So I think part of the problem in terms of the financial side is that the UK government themselves, in terms of our established institutions and the law, are effectively complicit in allowing this to happen.
Now, Alan,
Yeah,
this is.
yeah.
Sorry, were you going to say something there?
Sorry, I was going to come in just with a follow-up
Sure.
to that, if I can. How absolutely correct that it is the safety and the regulation and the legal structure that we have that makes all this money and these investments very welcoming. But the one side of Brexit, and we can debate and argue Brexit, but one side of it is we now have, the United Kingdom government now has something called a global human rights sanctions regulations, whereby Dominic Raab can sign off sanctions which would involve financial sanctions against persons in other countries who are found to be guilty of certain forms of human rights abuses, torture, cruelty, that side of things, slavery. Now, it's a first stage. I understand the regulations are likely to be expanded into other areas. But what is important and what we're hearing is that we need to see more biting using the teeth that the government has and the blind eye. There are the tools there, and certainly we've now got a new, just recently on the 7th of July, Dominic Raab announced this sanctions regime that could lead to freezing at least of some of the dirty money. Now, hopefully this report and the attention it's getting will put a little bit of political momentum behind the fact that we shouldn't forget that this money that's coming in is often money with blood on its hands and is a robbery on these wonderful peoples we've earlier both been agreeing and talking about that are working in public sector for a pittance because basically they've been robbed by the oligarchs of their own regime and some of the political structures. Unfortunately, of course, if you cut off Britain, probably the argument will be the money will still go elsewhere. So this is something that is going to be a long time in being stopped, but it certainly is a haven that is all too attractive, that we're seeing a lot more could be done to shut it off. And let's hope that this new sanctions regulation that we're going to be watching and pursuing Dominic Raab to get more research going on into where has this money come from, what's the background to it, and is there justification for making life a little somewhat more difficult for money with blood on its hands coming into the United Kingdom. I think we need to think of that perspective as well.
Now we've seen some of these oligarchs, people like Oleg Deripaska, we know had contact with people like Peter Mandelson, George Osborne. We know that there's been millions of pounds donated to the Tory party by people with pretty close links to Putin. How confident are you that some of those kind of close personal links that have been made through sort of London high society make it more difficult to break these change and to impose those kind of sanctions?
Oh goodness! Of course, it's making it difficult. I mean, there's a very strong city financial club linked to power and influence in London. And at the end of the day, people will still work to the regulations and the laws that we have. It is a clever way that they are bent. There is a whole legal establishment as well, that will argue and find ways around the use and application of the funds. But certainly the power and influence is a matter of grave concern. I mean, I'm in London, a private citizen and an academic, but it does worry me that when there's big money involved, big projects, planning, buildings, property purchases, decisions being made, that if money is changing hands, and there's just been a recent issue on a planning question, it's the public, it's the men in the street like myself who are going to suffer from decisions that are ill considered. And I have to say, and I'm sure my colleague here as well has been watching, as a British taxpayer, I'm becoming a little bit uneasy about the way some of my taxes are being spent on some aspects of public projects, and really beginning to wonder if the logic, when you start to smell, where's the logic in this? It could be there isn't any logic. The only logic is there's money talking here. So yeah, I am very concerned, but I'm just speaking as one single member of the public there, that I think we need to see more evidence that there will be a very strong follow-up to this report, and a much cleaner act in the areas of money and influence in London in the future. We've been wishing that for years, and my colleague here has done great work in attempting that, and I'm sure will continue.
Well, as we do look towards the future, Roger, you worked on some of this, trying to clean up the financial issues. Do you get the feeling that this Russia report is going to lead to any great changes moving forwards, either in the financial sphere or in the wider political and even military spheres?
Well, in the financial, I'm not very optimistic. I mean, one of the things I did was I looked at who had been called to give evidence, and nobody who has been critical of the City of London in relation to some of the matters we've been talking about was called to give evidence. It was the usual suspects who I'm very suspect of in all sorts of regards. And I would like to go back to something that Alan said. Alan rightly pointed out to the recent announcement of human rights type regulation. I sat in the Regulatory Reform Committee, and I can tell you that the interest of the Tories in particular in the Regulatory Reform Select Committee was simply to have a bonfire of regulations. They want to reduce regulations. They want to reduce the requirements of transparency as it operates in relation to the City of London. And that is something which I think would mean that as an ordinary citizen, Alan, as I am an ordinary citizen, we should be particularly concerned about. So what you have on the one hand is you have the nice rhetoric about what we're going to do to have a much stronger moral dimension here, going hand in hand at the same time, often very quietly through Parliament, deregulation that is making it more difficult for people to enforce proper standards.
Look towards the future. We, as you said, there's an election coming up in Belarus. There's issues in other countries. There's still a kind of proxy war happening in Syria. How confident are you that this report and the similar kind of things like the Mueller report in the States are going to lead to a different approach to Russia from the West?
Well, I'm a great believer in public engagement. I mean, nowadays we've got more possibilities through media networking. It is, to some extent, rather unfortunate. We're only at the beginning of a government period, and nearer the end, maybe governments are a little bit more willing to listen to the people on this. But I'm inclined to agree with Roger. I'm not really very confident because I'm reaching that age. I've watched our financial institutions go on a one-way slide from a degree of morality that existed there probably through the 70s into 80s, and then the Big Bang, the city in the 80s, the yuppie period, unbridled greed and investment, and then deregulation that happened actually with the banks under the Labour government, 97, 98, Gordon Brown's deal. Neither side really has their hands all that clean all the way on this. And there are huge, powerful influences there. I think pressure to turn the tap off of this money in one way or another. I mean, at least we've got this global human rights regulation, and it's for pressure groups and action groups not to let our decision makers and politicians away with doing nothing. So I'm actually making a massive appeal for a lot more civic engagement and civic activism. As somebody who actually worked with youth in a wonderful organization called the European Youth Parliament, I spent the last nearly 25 years of my life trying to encourage young people to engage politically, to be active, to think about what's happening. And the sad thing is, we had a very easy period, and I used to lecture on the fact, don't fall asleep. Democracies that fall asleep will have problems. They'll be walked over. And I rather feel, that the best hope is that there is much more surveillance and political engagement to actually draw attention to these difficulties. But I completely agree. When it comes to big money, my goodness, that's going to be an uphill struggle to change anything. So just a cautious optimism that if through awareness, programs like this, a discussion like this, and much wider, and pressure to see results, at least we still have a degree of a democracy. And if we keep these paper voting system, I think we'll have a pretty robust, untampered with vote the next time round. And let's hope that our politicians have got something a bit more to be proud of than where we are at the moment.
And when you're looking at people getting engaged, people kind of fighting back, if you like, as we said, there's that election in Belarus in just a couple of weeks. But we've also seen, for example, Putin kind of rewriting the constitution of Russia. Do you have any hope that the people in Russia, in Belarus, are going to be able to assert themselves against these strongmen dictators?
Well, there's no problem about them asserting themselves. The problem is what the result will be. They're actually asserting themselves at the moment. And thank you for the opportunity to briefly extend the discussion from Russia to the small country of Belarus, 9.5 million, but they're right on the Polish border, and they're only a 2.5-hour flight from London, and they're also on the border of Lithuania, Latvia, and I've got Ukraine to the south. They're actually geopolitically an incredibly important country. Vladimir Putin knows that. The people of Belarus are people essentially themselves with European cultural and moral and religious values. Many of them are studied and done well across Europe, in the United Kingdom, and they are at this stage. Many of them wear a T-shirt with the words 3% on it. There's only 3% support for their dictator, Alexander Lukashenko, that's been in power for 26 years. However, the dictator has his levers on the hands of power, the military, the security forces. And watch this space. There's an election on the 9th of August. And sadly, the last Ukraine changes in 2014 and ended up with killing and blood on the streets of Kiev, 100+ people shot. Very sadly, the resolve of the Belarus people is going to be tested very highly. But what's more important is, once again, this is another example that governments must not be sleeping. The resolve of the Western governments, who are very good on words over human rights, the question is, will they act, and what tools do they have actually to act over a very sensitive country, bordered by Russia and bordered by European Union. So, yes, I'm fully aware, and the Belarus people will certainly act in strength and in large numbers, but there's very likely to be retaliation. And this is a president who basically decides that he will stay in power, and he will be in power the day after the election. The announcement is entirely predictable. I would put a very, very large wager on the fact that on Monday afternoon, the 10th of August, there will be a declaration in Belarus that Alexander Grigorovich Lukashenko has been elected president of the Republic of Belarus. Where the numbers came from is another question, however.
And Roger, we only have a few minutes left, so I'd just like to turn back to Scotland. And we talked a little bit at the beginning of the show about moves towards independence. If Scotland does become independent anytime soon, where does it lie in the kind of geopolitical sphere? What is the role that Scotland can take, both in defending against this kind of interference and aggression, and also in perhaps influencing the wider world to improve the situation for people in Belarus and the people of Russia as well?
Well, the way in which I would think about that from my own experience, I mentioned a little bit about some of the work I did before becoming an MP, and I worked in many different parts of what are called the developing world. What impressed me there was the work of a number of small states in the world: Iceland, Norway, Ireland, Denmark, and the like, and the way in which they were purposefully engaging and trying to support people on the ground and help them to develop the capacities that Alan has talked so eloquently about, that we need to encourage the development of community, of democracy, and the like. Scotland is not going to be a world military power, nor would I want it to aspire to be. However, we are going to have a lot of expertise. We've got a lot to contribute in a purposeful way to communities in many parts of the world. And that's the kind of role I would like to see. So I think there is a community of relatively small nations who know that they're not going to be able to have influence through military might, but they're going to be able to have influence through intellect and engagement with people. And that's where I think Scotland should look towards position itself.
I can't resist coming very quick to the Verdi. The
Certainly,
foreign minister of Belarus, his name is Maki, and he spells it Mackei when it's transliterated. He actually has ancestors that are from the Mackay families in Scotland. So we've got Scottish influence, and I'm a Scot from Edinburgh, and I'm really proud of the way in which we extend and work with the world. A man's a man for all that.
A perfect way to end. Thank you very much, Alan and Roger, both of you, for joining us. It's been a really interesting discussion. And thank you at home for joining us as well. If you want to help us create more programs like this, as I say, I think this has been a really fascinating discussion, then please do go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register. Sign up there as a supporter, and your £5 a month helps us, first of all, to pay the bills here in the studio, but also to keep developing the channel and keep being able to produce more and more shows like this. We have an ambition to be a proper national broadcaster for Scotland, but we can only do that with your support. So if you can, please do support us financially. If you can't, then don't worry. The shows will always be free to view online, but you can still help us. You can follow us on Twitter at Broadcast Scot. You can find us on Facebook. And from there, you can share the shows around, let people know what's happening on Broadcasting Scotland, what kind of shows we make, what you find interesting about what we do. Let people know, because we can't afford to spend a lot of money on marketing, but your word of mouth can be a huge help to us in spreading the word about what we do here. And finally, if you want to get involved in making these kinds of shows, then there's lots of opportunities here, especially as lockdown starts to really lift. We are able to have a few more people in the studio now. So do please let us know if there's anything you'd like to do in terms of producing television programs, whether it's working as a journalist behind the scenes, whether it's working on the technical side of things, or hosting shows like I do. Then please do get in touch with us. There are lots and lots of opportunities. You just need to let us know what you want to contribute, and we will find a role for you. But that is all we have time for this evening. So once again, thank you very much to Roger Mullen and to Dr. Alan Flowers. It has been such a pleasure speaking to both of you. And thank you at home for joining us as well. I will be back on Sunday with the full Scottish. Then Gordon will be back on Monday with another Scotland at 7. But until then, have a lovely weekend. Good night.